Back in August of 2011, I went to visit a really close friend of mine in Trinidad, Colorado. It had been a while since we'd seen each other, and I was coming through town, so we planned a couple of days to hang out, do some camping right outside of town, and get a day hike in. There's a really nice campground not far from his house called Trinidad Lake State Park, so that's where we stayed. It's a beautiful area with the lake there and tons of trails, and I was really looking forward to it. I got into town on Sunday, August 21st, and we spent the afternoon catching up, setting up camp, and just relaxing in the sun. That night, after we'd had dinner, we just sat in our camp chairs and enjoyed the nice night. We were talking about all sorts of things, but around 10:30 or so, we both noticed something unusual. There were two lights hovering above the hills toward Fisher's Peak, which is this big rocky peak that's flat on top like a plateau. At first, we thought they were helicopters, but the way they moved was not normal. They would zip back and forth above the peak, gaining altitude, then rapidly losing altitude. They really seemed to defy anything I've ever seen. We were both completely focused on them for several minutes and asking each other what they could possibly be when we saw the lights turn a bright red color and shoot over the hills and out of sight. We stayed there staring at each other, totally stunned, and using some colorful language about what had just happened. We joked that we'd both just had an actual UFO sighting, but there was no denying how odd it was, and we both knew it. It really got our adrenaline flowing, but we needed to get some sleep because we were hiking the next day, so a little bit later we ended up going to bed. The next day was Monday, August 22nd, and we decided to hike the Discovery, Fisher's Peak, and Goldenrod Loop Trail. It's about a 6-mile loop, and the weather was going to be perfect that day. I think the high was in the upper 70s. We started mid-morning, and the trail wound around some gorgeous scenery with views of Fisher's Peak and the surrounding hills. We stopped for lunch at a viewpoint about halfway through and talked about how nice it was to be out there and how much we missed hiking together. The lights from the night before were still on our minds, and we kept mentioning it, half expecting to see something strange again. On the way back to the trailhead, we were heading downhill on a section of the trail when we heard something that literally stopped us dead in our tracks. It was the most bizarre sound I've ever heard. Out of nowhere, there was this massive, deep knocking noise. I'm not exaggerating when I say it sounded like someone was knocking on the earth itself. It was a huge noise. The sound echoed through the valley below and in every direction. We could feel it in our feet and legs, like the vibration of it was running through the ground. We were looking around everywhere, trying to figure out where it was coming from, but it was just everywhere. I don't know how many times we heard it, but it went on for what seemed like a couple of minutes, then just stopped. We looked at each other completely baffled. Neither of us had any idea what could make a sound like that. I mean, I almost want to say it reminded me of loud thunder because it was that loud, but at the same time, it was totally different. It was definitely as sonically big and loud as thunder and was like a giant rhythmic pounding in the earth. It had to have been heard for miles in every direction. After it stopped, we finished the hike and talked about the noise the entire way. Back at the campground, we cooked dinner and spent the evening by the lake. As the sun went down, we tried to put the weirdness of the day behind us and enjoy being outdoors. Later that night, just before midnight, we were completely startled yet again. This time, by the ground itself. Everything around us started shaking violently, and we couldn't believe it, but it was an actual earthquake. We jumped out of our chairs and grabbed onto a nearby tree for something to hang on to. It lasted for what felt like a long time, but it was probably very short. When it stopped, we were both totally rattled and standing there trying to process what had just happened. Not long after that, a park ranger came by to check on everyone, and we learned that it had been a fairly significant earthquake. He said he had gotten a call that it was a 5.3 on the Richter scale. Luckily, no one around the campground seemed hurt, and there didn't seem to be much damage. I think everyone was more shocked than anything else. The next morning, we packed up and went back to my friend's house in Trinidad. We wanted to grab a quick lunch before I had to head out of town. The earthquake was all over the news, and I guess there were several buildings and homes in town that had significant damage. As we watched the coverage, we couldn't help but talk about how strange the last couple of days had been. The crazy lights we'd seen the night before the earthquake, and that huge knocking noise during our hike, and then the earthquake itself. We both strongly felt it was all connected somehow, but as far as we could tell, no one else was talking about strange lights over the peak or the loud noise. I was really surprised the news hadn't mentioned anything about that, or that people hadn't called it in. Like I said, the entire area had to have heard that noise. After driving back home, I couldn't stop thinking about it, and the whole trip just stuck with me. It was months later, while I was sitting at work, randomly doing more research online for any reports of weird lights or loud, booming noises, and that's when I finally stumbled across a YouTube video. 2 hikers had been on another trail in that same area and on the same day we were, and they had recorded the knocking noise on their phone. The video captured it perfectly. The sound was exactly as I remembered it. Deep, rhythmic, echoing, and massive. I couldn't believe I had actually found a recording of it. I sent the link to my friend immediately. We were both relieved to know that someone else had heard it too, because it confirmed we weren't insane. To this day, it is by far the most bizarre series of events that has ever happened to me. Between the lights, the noise, and the earthquake, it all felt too coincidental to be unrelated. I feel lucky to have experienced it and walked away unharmed, but it also makes me wonder what in the world was actually going on. What caused all of that to happen, one super weird event after another? Was it something natural, something the government was involved in, or something beyond Earth? My friend and I still talk about it when we get together, and it was a mind-blowing experience that neither one of us will ever forget. I'm sending in the short video I found with my story so you can see what the 2 other hikers caught on their camera. This is not us hiking, but it's exactly the sound we heard that day. I would love to hear any ideas of what it could have been, and I'd also love to know if it had anything to do with the lights we saw the night before or the major earthquake that happened that very night. I was shocked that no one else mentioned it on the news or in the paper or anywhere. I feel like there have to be so many more people that experienced all of this. I grew up on the big island of Hawaii, kind of out in the countryside where everything felt open and peaceful. It was the early 1990s, and my family lived in a modest house that was backed by a large horse and cow pasture, and there was a large park and a reservoir nearby. I was fairly young at the time, and my belief in Santa Claus was as strong as any other kid's. I'm not certain, but I believe I was 7 years old, and definitely still believed wholeheartedly in all of the Christmas magic. That year, Christmas Eve was particularly exciting. My older brother, who was 2 years older than me, and I had been talking all day about what Santa might bring us. We'd been good all year, or at least we thought we had, and our mom had even let us stay up a little later than usual to watch a Christmas movie before bed. By the time it was lights out, I could barely hold still with anticipation. My brother and I shared a room back then, and we each had these custom-made loft beds that were higher off the ground than normal beds. They were built that way for storage reasons so we could stash our toys, games, and a few bins underneath. My bed was positioned right next to the window, which was almost level with my mattress, so I could easily see right outside into the backyard whenever I was lying down. That night, I remember the moon being really bright, and the sky was mostly clear except for a few scattered clouds. As my mom came to tuck us in, I remember staring out the window while she adjusted my blankets. The window gave me a perfect view of the open fields behind our house. I could see the outlines of the pasture fences and the trees near the reservoir, and everything looked quiet and still. I knew I wasn't going to sleep easily, so I tried to just look out the window and hope morning would come quickly. I wasn't really trying to look for anything in particular, but as I glanced up toward the sky, I saw something that made me hold my breath for a second. At first, I wasn't even sure what I was looking at. Above the reservoir, I could see that something was hovering in the air. It wasn't a plane or a helicopter, that much I knew. It was made up of what looked like small circles of light, perfectly aligned in a row. The lights were bright but didn't hurt my eyes, and they were all different colors: red, green, blue, yellow, and probably a couple of other colors too. What struck me the most was how they seemed to rotate, almost like they were spinning around each other. As they moved, the colors would shift and blend together, creating this mesmerizing, glowing effect that I thought looked amazing. I could see that the entire object was moving across one of the pastures and toward the reservoir, but also going up into the air at the same time. I remember staring at it completely focused and now sitting up in bed, but I wasn't scared at all. My 7-year-old brain was thinking for a minute, then it immediately jumped to the one obvious conclusion. This had to be Santa on his sleigh. I was so excited I could barely contain myself. I figured it had to be him because it looked like he was in between properties and delivering gifts, or at least that's what I thought he was doing. I watched the lights shift from side to side, which to me seemed like a sleigh leaning left and right, and then it would hover perfectly still again. The lights were still rotating and changing colors the entire time. Then, without any warning, it shot straight up into the sky so fast that I almost couldn't follow it with my eyes. As soon as that happened, I shouted to my brother and my mom, yelling for them both to come to the window. My brother rolled over and started to get out of bed, and then my mom quickly came through the door with a look of anxiety and fear on her face. Looking back, I'm guessing she thought something was wrong with one of us. She walked over to my bed looking half annoyed, and I just kept pointing and telling her to look outside and that Santa was flying past our house. I was sure she'd see it too, but when she finally looked out the window, her reaction wasn't what I expected. She hesitated for a second and just said, "Yeah, okay, it's Santa, but it's time for bed now, and if you're not asleep, he won't stop at our house." At the time, I remembered being frustrated with her response, but in my mind, it was obvious what I had just seen. It had to be Santa. Why else would there be something so strange and magical in the sky on Christmas Eve? My brother climbed back into his bed and also gave me an annoyed look. I think he was at the age where he had recently grown out of the Santa thing and had already talked to my parents about who was actually putting gifts under the tree. To me, though, it just felt like one more piece of Christmas magic, and now I wanted to get to sleep because I didn't want him to pass our house. As excited and full of adrenaline as I was, I laid my head down and almost forced myself to go to sleep. The next morning, I woke up to the usual Christmas chaos. Gifts under the tree, the smell of my mom's cinnamon rolls in the kitchen, and my brother already tearing through wrapping paper like a maniac. As soon as I walked out into the living room, I told him again that I couldn't believe I had actually seen him, but he just shrugged at me and said maybe. My mom brushed it off as my imagination and didn't seem interested in talking about it, so I let it go and enjoyed Christmas like any other kid would. It wasn't until years later when I was a teenager that I thought about that night again. I was watching a commercial on TV, and I don't remember what product was being sold, but whatever it was, it had these colorful animated lights floating around it, and it instantly flipped this memory switch in my brain. That entire experience of seeing the lights on Christmas Eve came flooding back in, and I started remembering every detail. It was a weird experience, actually, because I hadn't thought about it even one time since it happened, and I couldn't believe that I had forgotten. By then, I didn't believe in Santa, obviously, but I couldn't stop thinking about it, and I wondered what it was that I had seen. The older I got, the more I thought about it, and the stranger the whole experience seemed. I realized now that what I saw was absolutely real, and I was in no way imagining or dreaming any of it. When I think about the way it was moving, and how the lights rotated and morphed into each other, and especially the speed it went when it shot up into the sky and disappeared, I can't come up with any explanation that isn't extraterrestrial. I've even talked to my brother about it, and while he remembers it happening, he didn't actually see anything since he came to my window too late that night. The whole thing has made me dive deeply into UFO sightings and strange phenomena over the years, and I'll always wonder if that's what I saw. I'll never know for sure, but the one thing I do know is that there was something incredible outside of our house that night. Whatever it was real, and it's something I'm never going to forget. When I was a teenager, I started having really strange and vivid nightmares. I always told myself that they were just dreams, but there was something about them that felt different. They were fragmented like most dreams are, but they always involved me being abducted by some kind of alien entity that I could never quite see. I didn't tell many people about it and figured it was just my imagination running wild, maybe from watching too many movies or hearing stories that got stuck in my head. Eventually, the nightmares stopped as I got older, and I stopped thinking about them altogether. 11 years later, and I'm now an adult with 2 kids and a girlfriend. Life is busy and chaotic, and those old nightmares were just a distant memory until last summer. Out of nowhere, I started having the dreams again, and they were exactly like the ones I had as a teenager. When I say exactly the same, I mean it. Down to every little detail, they are the same dreams. I always feel this strange heavy pressure, like I'm floating or being pulled out of bed. Then I see several figures with smooth gray faces and large dark eyes taking me from my house and bringing me somewhere that is eerily familiar but also terrifying to me at the same time. I can tell they're going to be doing things to me, but I can't do anything about it. It's a very helpless and claustrophobic feeling. These dreams never seem to go past that part though. And then I just wake up in a full-blown state of panic every single time, and I can't go back to sleep for the rest of the night. By mid-July, the nightmares weren't just occasional. They were becoming constant, sometimes happening several times a week. Then I started waking up with small bruises on my arms and legs, and I couldn't figure out where they were coming from. It looked like I'd been grabbed or pressed against something, but I figured I must have been thrashing around in my sleep, so I decided it was time to talk to someone about it. I didn't want to say anything to my girlfriend or anyone else, but I made up my mind to set up a counseling appointment to either figure out why I was having these dreams, or at the very least, get some drugs to knock me out at bedtime and stop them from happening. That same night, something happened that freaked me out more than anything else I've ever experienced. My girlfriend and I were putting our kids to bed, and I was standing in the doorway of my son's room while she tucked him in. He couldn't see me from where I was standing, and I was only half paying attention to what they were saying. Then I heard him tell his mom that I was going to be okay. She asked him what he meant by that, and he told her that I was worried about being taken up to the ship again and not coming back. I completely froze, and hearing him say that actually took my breath away. Then I leaned in closer to his door to listen. He told her that the ship belonged to the planet strangers and that they told him not to worry because they wouldn't hurt me and promised to bring me back. He said it in such a matter-of-fact way too, like it was something completely normal. My girlfriend humored him, saying that she was glad they were going to bring me back because I had to go to work the next day. Then they finished saying goodnight, and that was the end of it. Hearing him say that hit me so hard that I actually had to go outside for a breath of fresh air. My girlfriend must have seen me go out because she came outside as soon as she left his room, still smiling and thinking what he said was funny. I must have looked shaken because she immediately asked me what was wrong. That's when I completely broke down and told her everything. I told her about the nightmares I'd been having, how they had started when I was a teenager and then started happening again in June, and how I'd been losing so much sleep every week and waking up with bruises. I told her I hadn't said anything to anyone because I didn't want to worry the family and sound crazy. The way my son talked about it was so specific and calm, and he used words and ideas he couldn't have possibly gotten from me, like planet strangers. Where did he get planet strangers from? And why would he even be thinking about something like that? I've never mentioned anything about the dreams or what I was going through around him or anyone else. Then he tells his mom out of the blue that I'm going to be okay? I know kids say weird things all the time, but this was on a whole other level. I did end up talking to a therapist about 2 weeks after that and had maybe 3 more appointments over the next couple of months, but that was all the counseling I did. The weird thing is, the dreams stopped happening the very night my son said those things, and I haven't had a single nightmare since. I have to stop and wonder how that's possible. Why would my dreams just suddenly stop the second my son said those things? The whole thing is very disturbing to me, and I don't even like to think about it because it gets too real. It's like something out of a movie, but it's not a movie. It actually happened, and that fact scares me so much I have to distract myself with something else when I start to think about it.